They thought they could bully us into submission. They trespassed, they yelled, and then they laid hands on my wife. What they didn't know, I'm a retired Navy SEAL, and I don't back down when my family's safety is on the line. What started as an HOA fine turned into an all-out war. Stay with me, because this story doesn't just end in revenge. It ends in justice. Make sure to subscribe, and stick around till the end, because what I did next shook the entire neighborhood and exposed the corrupt power they try to hide. In the quiet corners of a leafy suburb, nestled between rows of near-identical homes and pristine sidewalks, life seemed like a postcard. Retired after decades of intense service, the man had chosen this neighborhood for its promise of peace and normalcy. It wasn't the biggest house on the block, nor the flashiest, but it was theirs. A modest, well-maintained property with a carefully tended garden his wife adored, a front porch where she often sipped tea in the mornings, and a sense of security they both cherished after years of sacrifice. At first, the Homeowners Association appeared to be what they claimed, a group devoted to maintaining order, property values, and community aesthetics. A few letters arrived in the mail, mostly generic notices about trash bins and yard maintenance schedules. He didn't think much of them. Rules were rules. He'd lived a life governed by structure, discipline, and attention to detail. If there were neighborhood expectations, he had no problem abiding by them. In fact, he appreciated the idea of shared standards. But it didn't take long for that structure to start feeling less like order and more like control. The first real indication came with a notice taped to their front door. Improper garden border edging. His wife had used natural stone to line her flower beds, a project that had taken her weeks of planning and careful execution. She poured her heart into it, her therapy, her peace. The letter demanded it be removed or comply materials be installed by the end of the week or face escalating fines. They shrugged it off as overzealousness. Maybe someone on the board didn't like the look of it. Still, the rocks stayed. After all, they weren't blocking pathways, weren't sharp, and certainly weren't an eyesore. In fact, neighbors often complimented the front yard. But another notice followed, then a second, then a fine. It didn't stop there. Next came complaints about unauthorized decorations. His wife had hung a simple seasonal wreath on the front door. Nothing flashy, just a touch of spring color with dried lavender and wildflowers. They were told it violated the neighborhood's uniform aesthetic, even though nearly every house on the block had something on their doors. When they pointed that out, the HOA insisted those were approved styles, though they couldn't provide any documentation to support that claim. Things started to feel less like maintenance and more like targeting. A neighbor across the street had mismatched patio furniture on their lawn. No notice. The house next door had string lights still up from Christmas. No violation. But somehow, every week, the couple received fresh complaints. Paint color, planter size. Even the garden hose reel mounted on the sidewall was suddenly an issue. Still, they complied where it made sense. The wreath came down. The hose reel was moved. They removed a wind chime after receiving a bizarre complaint that it disrupted tranquility. Yet the letters kept coming. The tone in the HOA's communication grew sharper, more condescending. It no longer sounded like guidance. It felt like a threat. The stress began to mount. His wife, who once joyfully spent her afternoons tending the garden, now hesitated before stepping outside. Every time she did, it felt like eyes were watching, ready to pounce on the slightest misstep. The joy that had once radiated from their little front yard was now shadowed by constant scrutiny. Neighbors began whispering that others had received similar treatment when they questioned board decisions. There were stories of people being fined for invisible violations, grass too tall, even though it was freshly mowed, or a non-compliant mailbox post, even though the design matched others in the neighborhood. But most stayed quiet, afraid to speak up. After all, the HOA controlled access to common areas, community events, and even approvals for home improvements. Crossing them could mean living under siege. It became clear that this wasn't about neighborhood harmony or property values. It was about power, and it was being wielded without oversight, without fairness, and with disturbing levels of aggression. He began to observe the patterns, not as a paranoid homeowner, but with the trained eye of a man who'd spent years analyzing threats and identifying intent behind behavior. This wasn't just random enforcement. It was targeted, deliberate, and escalating. The final straw in that first wave came a notice stating they were in ongoing violation for failing to remove the stone border from the flower bed. Attached was a fine, larger than any before. The letter included language suggesting that failure to comply could result in legal recourse, and even mentioned potential lien placement against the property. That was when the shift happened, not in fear, but in mindset. What was once dismissed as bureaucratic overreach was now being recognized for what it truly was: harassment. This wasn't an HOA keeping order. This was a group emboldened by unchecked authority. And they had just picked a fight with the wrong man. What they didn't know was that the house they targeted wasn't just owned by a retired couple. It was protected by someone who had spent his entire life defending what was right. Someone who knew how to gather evidence, build a case, and strike only when the time was right. The HOA had crossed a line, and while they thought they were just enforcing rules, they were about to learn what consequences truly looked like. The tone of the neighborhood began to shift in subtle, unsettling ways. What had once been a place of calm was now laced with tension. Every walk to the mailbox, every moment spent on the front porch, came with a distinct feeling of being watched. Cars slowed down unnecessarily in front of the house, especially the white SUV with the HOA logo crudely plastered on the side. It was as if the enforcers had designated the property as a surveillance target. Soon, unannounced visits began. HOA board members, particularly two younger, self-important individuals, started appearing on the property without warning. Sometimes they walked into the yard, taking photos with clipboards in hand. Other times they stood near the sidewalk for minutes at a time, pretending to measure things, pretending to check alignment, while clearly just inspecting for any minor detail they could weaponize into a violation. They never rang the bell. They never left a formal notice in person. They simply came, watched, documented, and vanished. The focus began narrowing on his wife. It became obvious. The letters, the citations, and the visits were increasingly centered around her daily routines. If she watered the plants slightly past sunset, there'd be a notice for disrupting quiet hours. If she sat in a lawn chair with a book, they would send a warning about unauthorized furniture on the front lawn. Even her choice of sun had one day sparked a mention of unapproved attire reflecting negatively on neighborhood standards. At first, they thought perhaps it was personal. Maybe a board member held a grudge or had some vendetta. But no clear reason surfaced. They had paid every due on time. They had never filed any complaint against anyone. They had never opposed a rule publicly. Yet the enforcement grew more aggressive, more invasive, and alarmingly one-sided. It became a daily battle. Trash cans had to be brought in within minutes of pickup. The grass had to be cut to exactly the HOA-mandated height, or fines would follow. One morning, his wife found a warning flag planted in her flower bed, accusing her of harboring invasive species. The irony stung. The flowers were native to the region and sold by the local nursery down the road. Word around the neighborhood confirmed their suspicion. Others had once been targets too. Quiet retirees, new families, anyone who stood out even slightly from the invisible mold the HOA board worshipped. A couple down the street, who had dared to paint their mailbox post a shade lighter than HOA white, had been fined into silence. Another resident, a disabled veteran, had received notices claiming his handicap ramp was aesthetic clutter. The HOA had a pattern: bully until compliance, threaten until silence. The man's wife, once vibrant and social, began withdrawing. She no longer spent her mornings in the garden. She skipped neighborhood events out of fear of passive-aggressive confrontations. Her anxiety spiked each time a car slowed in front of their home. The yard, once her pride, became a place of dread. Then came the verbal harassment. During one of the HOA enforcer's so-called inspections, words were exchanged, not by the husband, but his wife, who simply asked why she was being treated so differently. The man responded with mocking condescension and implied she didn't understand community regulations. From that point forward, the behavior escalated to open hostility. She was followed while walking their dog. Loud remarks were made just loud enough for her to hear. Even other residents began to notice the strained fixation the enforcers had developed on their home. Complaints were filed, civil, professional, reasonable. They emailed the HOA board, demanding explanations. In return, they received cold replies packed with vague legal jargon and warnings that further accusations would be treated as harassment of board members. The irony was thick, but the message was clear. Push back, and we'll bury you in technicalities. It became clear the board wasn't just enforcing rules. They were abusing power, hiding behind a vague authority granted to them in a document most homeowners had never read closely. Their actions were meant to wear people down, to break their spirit, to force submission not through reason, but relentlessness. The tipping point came when the HOA scheduled a surprise compliance inspection, claiming they had a right to enter yards to verify prior citations. No prior notice. No homeowner consent. Just a text message sent 30 minutes before arrival. When the man's wife refused to allow them in through the gate, one enforcer became visibly irritated. He shouted vague threats about fines, legal action, and further consequences. She stood her ground, even as the enforcer mocked her, writing down notes with exaggerated flair, as if documenting some heinous crime. That evening she didn't eat. She didn't speak. She just stared at the same stone border in the garden they had installed together with so much care and joy, now seen only as a symbol of a conflict she never asked for. Something had to change. The harassment wasn't just annoying anymore. It was psychological warfare. It was a coordinated effort to exhaust, isolate, and control. And what the enforcers hadn't yet realized was that their tactics were starting to trigger instincts in the wrong person, the kind of instincts trained for much more serious threats. The battle had escalated, but they had no idea what storm was quietly building behind that front door. What had begun as a steady drip of harassment finally erupted into something far more serious, an act that shattered any illusion of civil boundaries. The HOA enforcers, emboldened by their unchecked power and the silence of most residents, took things too far. The warnings had morphed into fines. The fines evolved into threats. And the threats, left unchallenged long enough, turned into action. But this time, it wasn't another notice. It wasn't another smug email from the board. It was physical, it was invasive, and it was completely out of line. The day had been like any other, quiet, unremarkable. But beneath the surface, tension had reached a boiling point. The HOA enforcers had issued yet another baseless violation, this time accusing a couple of permanent alterations to the landscape. The issue? A stone border along the flower bed that had existed for over a year and was visible to anyone who ever passed by. It had never posed a hazard, never blocked access, never infringed on another's property. But to the board, it was non-compliant. And non-compliance meant action, without waiting for an appeal or response. Two of the enforcers took it upon themselves to enforce the order. No authorization, no warrant, no permission. They entered the property midday, claiming they had the authority to correct the violation. What they didn't expect was to find anyone at home. But his wife had been there, alone, tending to garden she cherished and trying to reclaim some sense of peace. They walked past the gate as if they owned the place. No knock, no announcement, just a bold intrusion under the assumption that their badges, issued by a neighborhood board, not a legal entity, gave them free rein over someone else's land. They began to remove the stones from the flower bed, tossing them aside like trash, breaking plants in the process. She called out, startled and confused. But instead of stopping or explaining, one of them responded with hostility. Words were exchanged. She insisted they leave. She reminded them it was private property. But their arrogance knew no limits. When she tried to physically stop one of them from yanking up the decorative stones, a confrontation followed. The enforcer shoved her, not a gentle push to create space, but a deliberate, aggressive motion that knocked her back into the dirt. It wasn't hard enough to break bones, but it left bruises on her arm, on her hip, and on her spirit. The men didn't stay long after that. Realizing the situation had escalated, they retreated without apology, leaving the garden in disarray. When her husband returned home, he found her shaken, sitting quietly near the disrupted flower bed. Her clothes were dusty, her hands trembled, and she struggled to even explain what had happened. But the bruises spoke volumes. The damaged plants and scattered stones confirmed the story. It was no longer a matter of paperwork or power trips. The HOA had committed an act of trespassing, vandalism, and assault. They had physically harmed a resident, and worse, his wife. Yet, when the incident was reported to local authorities, the response was disappointingly vague. The officers filed a report, but there was no immediate arrest, no definitive commitment to act. The enforcers claimed it was a misunderstanding, that they feared for their safety, and that they were only following protocol outlined in the bylaws. That defense might have held weight in the world of passive homeowners. But this situation had gone beyond the limits of any bylaw. No HOA regulation could justify assault. No administrative authority could override basic human rights or the laws governing private property. Still, the system stalled. The authorities, tied up in red tape and unsure how to navigate the blurred lines between civil governance and criminal behavior, offered no protection. The HOA, unsurprisingly, doubled down. They denied wrongdoing, claiming the incident was fabricated. They refused to speak with the couple directly and instead issued another formal notice, accusing them of interfering with board duties. The arrogance was astounding. Not only did they avoid accountability, they tried to turn the blame around. But something had shifted now. A line had been crossed. The emotional toll on the household was visible. What had once been frustration had transformed into something far more dangerous. Resolve. The fear that had quietly grown with each violation, each unannounced visit, each veiled threat, was gone, replaced by focus, purpose, determination. The man, trained to assess risk, analyze threats, and execute precise responses, now saw the situation through a very different lens. This was no longer about a flower bed. It wasn't even about the HOA. It was about justice. It was about safety. It was about making sure no one else in the neighborhood had to endure this kind of abuse again. The incident had triggered a chain reaction. Quiet neighbors began speaking up. Stories of similar confrontations surfaced. Some subtle, some severe, all marked by the same pattern. Intimidation and silence. The community had tolerated it for too long. But now, someone was willing to fight back, not just with words or emotion, but with discipline, evidence, and strategy. The HOA didn't realize it yet, but they had just awakened something far bigger than a complaint. They had provoked a response from someone who knew how to win wars, not just in combat, but in truth. And what was coming next wouldn't be a violation notice. It would be consequences. In the days that followed the assault, the atmosphere in the home became unusually still. It wasn't the stillness of fear, nor the kind that signals defeat. It was deliberate, controlled, the kind of silence that precedes calculated movement. While his wife rested and tried to recover from both the physical bruises and the emotional toll, he turned inward. But unlike the HOA board, whose power was built on noise, threats, and intimidation, he moved with quiet intention. The first step was documentation. Everything that happened, from the earliest warning letters to the day the enforcers stepped onto their property, was compiled. Dates, times, photos, emails, voicemail transcriptions, and screenshots. Every detail was preserved. The broken plants, the security footage from the outdoor cameras. Even the discarded violation notices were collected, sorted, and labeled. He didn't just want to prove a pattern. He wanted to dismantle their entire strategy piece by piece. Then came surveillance. New high-definition security cameras were installed on the property, hidden in plain sight. Front yard, backyard, side gates, and driveway. Each was motion-activated and streamed footage to secure off-site backup. The placement was precise, strategic. Not just to catch them in the act again, but to prevent them from twisting the truth. If they stepped foot on the property again, there would be no denials, no ambiguity, only evidence. While he handled logistics, his wife focused on healing. The garden, once a joyful expression of her personality, now bore marks of violation. But with each small restoration, replanting a broken stem, relining a row of stones, she reclaimed what was taken. Her strength returned slowly, not through confrontation, but through quiet defiance. She refused to let them steal her peace. Neighbors began noticing the shift. The same residents who had once looked away in fear or uncertainty now came forward cautiously. They whispered their own stories of silent suffering, Tales of fines for imaginary violations, threats of liens for unpaid dues that were never actually owed, and public shaming in HOA meetings when anyone dared question authority. He listened carefully, took notes, asked permission to document what they shared. Many agreed. Some preferred anonymity. Others, emboldened by the couple's resistance, were ready to stand up for the first time. Patterns emerged. The same names appeared repeatedly in complaints. The same enforcers, the same board members, the same tactics. They targeted elderly homeowners, widows, immigrants, and anyone they deemed uncooperative. They created rules mid-year, then retroactively enforced them. They held private meetings, never published minutes, and threatened legal action against anyone who asked to audit financial records. It was no longer just about one family. It was a systemic abuse of power rooted in secrecy and fueled by silence. But now, the silence was breaking. Instead of engaging the HOA in more verbal disputes, he shifted his energy toward building a case. Not a loud, public battle, but a quiet, tactical response. He studied state-level laws governing homeowners associations. He highlighted every clause they had violated, every procedural misstep, every breach of privacy, every instance where their behavior had exceeded their authority. He knew legal systems could be slow and frustrating, but he also knew how to navigate bureaucracy with precision. He also reached out to legal assistance groups specializing in HOA abuse cases. Attorneys with experience dismantling corrupt boards were consulted. Some offered advice. Others provided templates for formal letters and legal notices. With the guidance of professionals and the support of fellow residents, he began preparing a formal complaint to the county authorities and state oversight committees responsible for community association governance. At the same time, he crafted a narrative for the public, not a rant, not an attack, but a clear, factual presentation of the events. A timeline, a video montage, clips from security cameras, images of notices, statements from neighbors. He didn't want to wage war. He wanted to expose the truth. And once the truth was out, he trusted it would speak louder than anything the HOA board could fabricate. The enforcers, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes, continued their antics. More notices arrived, each one now collected and time-stamped. More passive-aggressive behavior followed. Capture on camera, archived, and added to file. But the couple no longer responded. No more emails. No more attempts to argue or appeal. They had gone silent. Strategically, that silence made the board uneasy. Accustomed to provoking reactions, they were suddenly met with restraint. It unnerved them, and in their arrogance, they mistook it for surrender. But this wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The man had spent years training for operations that required patience, observation, and precision. He knew when to act and when to wait. The HOA had crossed a line, and now he was preparing to draw one of his own, not in anger, but in accountability. Not through threats, but through undeniable proof. What they thought was victory was actually the calm before impact. Every minute that passed brought him closer to action. Every document gathered, every neighbor interviewed, every second of recorded footage brought them closer to a reckoning. What the HOA didn't know was that the target they had chosen was more prepared than they had ever imagined, and that justice, while patient, was already on its way. With the evidence mounting and the silence turning from submission into strategy, the balance of power began to shift. What was once a campaign of fear and intimidation began to unravel under the weight of documentation, legal knowledge, and quiet resistance. The HOA board, accustomed to acting with impunity, had unknowingly forced a man trained in discipline, structure, and tactical response into a position where patience was no longer passive. It was purposeful. The first step in turning the tide was a deep dive into the HOA's own foundation. He obtained a copy of the association's bylaws, policies, and financial statements through public record requests and homeowner rights laws. What he found confirmed what many had suspected but had never been able to prove. The board had been operating in the shadows, rewriting rules without due process, and enforcing them selectively to target specific residents. Amendments had been passed without quorum. Fines had been issued without proper warning procedures. Committees were filled with friends of board members, and no financial audits had been conducted in years. It wasn't just a matter of incompetence. It was corruption, and he had the receipts to prove it. The next step was outreach. Quiet conversations turned into organized cooperation. A private meeting of concerned homeowners was held, off-site, away from the HOA's eyes and ears. Word spread quickly. Dozens showed up, some carrying thick folders of their own violation letters, others bringing photographs, emails, or recorded conversations. Stories spilled out. One couple had been fined for unapproved lawn ornaments, their son's wheelchair-accessible ramp. Another family had received threats of foreclosure over dues they had already paid, and when they asked for proof, they were ignored. For the first time, there was unity. The residents realized they were not isolated victims. They were part of a larger pattern of control, manipulation, and abuse. And now they had a leader, someone willing to do more than vent or argue, someone who was building a plan. With a coalition forming, a formal petition was drafted to demand a full audit of the HOA's financials, enforcement records, and election procedures. State statutes were cited, precedents referenced, and signatures gathered. Within a week, over half the neighborhood had signed. It was enough to force legal recognition under the homeowners' rights legislation. The board was officially served with a request for transparency, and by law, they were required to respond within 30 days. But the pressure wasn't just legal. It was technological. He created a website, secure, simple, and anonymous, where residents could submit their stories, evidence, and questions. A timeline of documented violations was published, backed by visuals and records. Word spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news blogs picked up the story. Journalists looking into HOA abuses contacted him, curious about the extent of the evidence. A story that began with a flower bed now carried the weight of community-wide injustice. The HOA responded with arrogance. They issued a mass letter denouncing the misinformation campaign and accusing unnamed residents of defamation. But they offered no rebuttal, no evidence, and no transparency. Their refusal to engage only amplified suspicion. The silence from their end grew louder with every day they failed to respond to the legal requests. Residents who had once been indifferent now became vocal. The board's tactics of intimidation were falling apart, exposed for what they truly were, weak attempts to cling to control. He continued his work methodically. Audio recordings from board meetings were analyzed and time-stamped. Surveillance footage from his own cameras was clipped and organized. One video showed an enforcer tossing property decorations into the bushes. Another captured a verbal threat made during an unannounced yard inspection. Everything was being archived, prepared not just for public exposure, but for legal escalation. Lawyers who had initially been hesitant were now eager to participate. With community backing and documented abuse, a civil case could be built not just for the assault, but for years of mismanagement, financial misconduct, and harassment. Letters of intent were drafted. Mediation demands were sent. The board, once feared, was now backed into a corner, defensive, disorganized, and facing questions they couldn't ignore. Even those who once supported the HOA began to distance themselves. Former board members offered insight, quietly confessing to rushed decisions and behind-the-scenes manipulation. One revealed that fines were often created on the fly to pressure specific residents into compliance, especially those who questioned authority or requested audits. These confessions added credibility to the growing movement and exposed the rot at the heart of the organization. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. Where fear once lingered, now there was defiance. Residents no longer whispered their complaints. They voiced them openly. Lawn signs appeared calling for HOA reform. Anonymous flyers were distributed, explaining homeowners' rights. The front porch, once a symbol of stress and surveillance, became a place of community once again. People waved as they passed, nodded in solidarity, and began reclaiming their own spaces. The HOA board had underestimated the man they targeted. They had assumed he was just another homeowner to intimidate, another quiet resident to corner. But in doing so, they awoke the very skills, strategies, and discipline that had kept them alive in far more dangerous situations. And now, for the first time, it wasn't the residents on defense. It was the HOA, the enforcers, the bullies, the manipulators. The tide had turned. It wasn't slowing down. Momentum had shifted completely. What started as an isolated act of aggression had evolved into a neighborhood-wide reckoning. The HOA, once a looming presence that inspired fear and submission, now stood under the weight of scrutiny and collective resistance. The movement no longer depended on whispers or anonymous complaints. It had taken on a voice, and it was growing louder by the day. The man at the center of the storm, once viewed as just another homeowner on the receiving end of selective enforcement, had now become the architect of a calculated and professional exposure campaign. Each step had been deliberate, and now the time had come to move from gathering evidence to publicly revealing it. It was no longer about fighting back in silence. It was about pulling back the curtain and showing the entire community and beyond what had been happening behind the HOA's tightly closed doors. The compilation began with visuals. Hours of surveillance footage were combed through, trimmed, and stitched into a clear timeline of events. One video showed the exact moment the enforcer stepped onto private property without notice or consent. Another captured them tampering with a flower bed, laughing as they tossed stones and damaged plants. Most damning of all was the footage showing the shove, clear, undeniable, and time-stamped. No narration was needed. The images alone conveyed the truth, but the videos were just one layer. Audio recordings from the HOA's public meetings, captured legally under open meeting laws, revealed the board discussing enforcement strategies in vague yet disturbing terms, remarks about keeping certain households in check, and examples needing to be made. In one clip, a board member casually dismissed a resident's complaint as nuisance noise, followed by laughter. These moments painted a clear picture of an organization that had long abandoned its charter of community service in favor of control and arrogance. Documents were scanned and annotated, violation notices issued for non-existent rules, financial statements showing unexplained administrative expenses, meeting minutes that contradicted known events, emails from residents requesting clarification, ignored or answered with veiled threats. The paper trail was not just long, it was damning. Every file was cross-referenced with state laws and HOA bylaws, revealing at least a dozen clear violations of due process, privacy, and fiduciary duty. With everything prepared, the rollout began. The secure website created earlier now featured a dedicated portal, HOA Watch. It housed a full archive of documents, footage, audio, and written testimonies, organized by category and date. Visitors could browse through tabs marked trespassing, assault, financial irregularities, unlawful fines, and board misconduct. Each section included embedded videos, PDFs, and brief summaries explaining their legal relevance. A downloadable public report, written in plain language, summarized the entire case in 20 pages. Residents flooded the site. Within 48 hours, hundreds of unique visitors accessed the page. Comments and emails poured in, some from homeowners in other neighborhoods facing similar issues, others from legal professionals offering advice or assistance. Local media outlets took notice. A regional news blog published a story titled, HOA Horror, Local Board Accused of Abuse and Misconduct. The headline circulated quickly through social media, with a surveillance video of the shove garnering thousands of views in a matter of hours. The pressure began to mount from all directions. A county representative reached out to request a formal review of the HOA's conduct. A nonprofit legal aid organization that specialized in property rights contacted the neighborhood group and offered to assist in preparing a class action lawsuit. Even a state legislator commented publicly, using the case to highlight the need for stronger HOA regulation. Within the community, fear gave way to fury. Residents began openly discussing their own experiences at public meetings. Formerly silent homeowners now stood up and shared how they were fined for fabricated violations, how their appeals were ignored, and how they were made to feel like criminals for minor differences in decor or landscaping. One elderly resident recounted how she paid over $1,200 in fines for having a non-compliant fence, only to find out the rule didn't even exist in the written bylaws. The board, caught off guard by the intensity of the response, attempted damage control. A mass email was sent to all residents dismissing the website as unauthorized, claiming the videos were doctored, and warning against the spread of false information. But the message backfired. Residents knew what they had seen. They had lived the experiences. The more the board denied, the more unified the opposition became. Several of the enforcers resigned, quietly and without comment. A special meeting was called by residents to demand a vote of no confidence in the current board. The request met the necessary threshold, and an emergency election was scheduled under supervision from a third-party legal observer. The momentum was irreversible, but the man didn't celebrate. Not yet. Exposure wasn't the finish line. It was just the next phase. There were still legal battles ahead. Restitution needed to be pursued. Systems needed to be rebuilt. And most importantly, justice for the assault against his wife had yet to be delivered. Still, the operation had succeeded in its purpose. The truth was out. The fear was gone. And the people, once isolated in silence, now stood together in strength. The HOA had ruled by intimidation for years. But now, stripped of secrecy and exposed to the light, its power was collapsing under its own corruption. The community reached a boiling point. The exposure had pulled back the curtain, revealing not just incompetence, but deep, deliberate misconduct that could no longer be ignored. Residents who had long kept their heads down began organizing openly. Lawn signs appeared on dozens of properties reading, "Reclaim our neighborhood" and "HOA reform now." The one silent majority had awakened, and the board, once the enforcers of fear, now stood alone, cornered by the truth and the people they once controlled. The emergency vote of no confidence was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and the turnout was unprecedented. Homeowners filled the community clubhouse and overflowed into the surrounding lawn. Many who had once avoided HOA meetings altogether now stood shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, holding documents, printouts from the exposure site, and printed copies of bylaws. The gathering didn't feel like a meeting. It felt like a trial. Residents lined up to speak, one after another. They shared first-hand accounts of being fined for rules that never existed, of being harassed for asking questions, and of watching their neighbors suffer under selective enforcement. Elderly homeowners revealed how they'd paid fines they couldn't afford out of fear of retaliation. Young families described the anxiety of being watched and cited for harmless backyard toys or lawn decorations. The stories all pointed to the same pattern: abuse of power hidden behind a veil of bureaucracy. Then came the evidence. The footage of the assault, played before the crowd on a large screen, silenced even the most skeptical attendees. Gasps echoed through the room. The image of an HOA enforcer physically pushing a woman on her own property struck a nerve that no bylaw or policy could defend. The video couldn't be dismissed. It couldn't be rewritten. It was there, undeniable and deeply disturbing. The board attempted a weak defense, claiming miscommunication and selective editing. But their words rang hollow. Residents countered their statements with facts, timestamps, recorded conversations, documents proving board overreach and financial inconsistencies. Questions were asked that the board could not answer. Why were fines issued without warnings? Why were budgets unaccounted for? Why were rules changed without a vote? The silence that followed was not strategic. It was the silence of the cornered. As the vote proceeded, it became clear the board had lost the trust of the community, not by a small margin, but by an overwhelming majority. Ballots were cast, counted, and verified under independent supervision. When the results were announced, cheers erupted. The entire board had been voted out unanimously. Not a single member received enough support to remain. Residents embraced. Some wept. It wasn't just the end of a regime. It was the restoration of dignity. But the reckoning didn't stop at removal. Days later, formal complaints filed by the residents reached the desks of county investigators and state agencies tasked with HOA oversight. With the compiled evidence, recorded statements, and financial irregularities laid bare, authorities opened a formal investigation into the HOA's former leadership. Subpoenas were issued. Bank records were requested. The personal finances of board members came under review. What began as a grassroots effort now carried legal weight. The most egregious enforcers, those caught on camera trespassing, harassing, and ultimately assaulting, were named in civil suits. The man's legal team, now strengthened by pro bono support from civil rights attorneys, pursued charges of trespassing, assault, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The civil case was built not on emotion, but on indisputable evidence and community backing. The defendants tried to settle quietly, but the offer was declined. This wasn't just about restitution. It was about accountability. Under court order, the HOA's financials were made public. Thousands of dollars in unaccounted miscellaneous expenses were discovered. Funds meant for neighborhood improvements have been funneled into private reimbursements and personal purchases disguised as office supplies and administrative costs. Homeowners were shocked to learn that their dues had funded personal vacations, gift cards, and even legal consultations meant to intimidate residents. The revelations fueled additional lawsuits and prompted a full-scale audit of past board activities. A new interim board was formed by community vote. Unlike its predecessor, this group operated in the open, publishing meeting agendas, sharing budget details, and welcoming community feedback. Transparency became the standard. Committees were restructured, term limits introduced, and rules were reviewed publicly before any enforcement could take place. Residents who had once feared HOA meetings now attended with purpose, empowered by the knowledge that their voices mattered. The couple at the center of it all never sought applause, but the community recognized their courage. A letter signed by hundreds of residents thanked them for standing up, for refusing to be silenced, and for inspiring others to speak. What they endured had triggered a movement. Their refusal to back down had exposed a pattern of injustice and ultimately dismantled a corrupt system. The reckoning had come not in anger, but in truth, not with chaos, but with order. And the message was clear: power, when abused, will fall. No title, badge, or policy could protect those who use authority as a weapon. In this neighborhood, the people had taken back control, not with violence, but with resolve, unity, and the unshakable force of what is right. With the corrupt board removed, lawsuits in progress, and state investigations underway, a sense of balance finally began to return to the neighborhood. What had once been a place governed by intimidation and arbitrary rules was now evolving into a true community, one built on fairness, transparency, and mutual respect. The storm had passed, but the lessons it left behind would not be forgotten. The newly elected interim board wasted no time implementing reforms. Open meetings were scheduled and live-streamed for transparency. Financial statements were published monthly, down to the last receipt. Residents were invited to participate in decision-making processes. Committees were created with rotating members and mandatory term limits. Policies were reviewed in public forums, and any proposal to change rules required majority approval through an open vote. The days of backroom decisions and silent enforcement were over. One of the board's first decisions was to void all outstanding fines issued by the previous leadership that could not be supported by documented violations. Refunds were initiated for residents who had paid illegitimate penalties. The board also negotiated with a community mediation service to provide neutral support in case of future disputes. Rather than perpetuating conflict, the new leadership prioritized dialogue and understanding. The most symbolic moment came when the damaged flower bed, the origin point of the entire ordeal, was formally acknowledged at a public meeting. A resolution was passed stating that private landscaping decisions, within reason, would remain the choice of the homeowner unless they directly endangered others. The board publicly apologized to all residents who had been unfairly targeted, and a moment of silence was held to recognize the emotional toll the previous board had inflicted on families across the neighborhood. But justice was not just administrative, it was personal. The legal cases moved forward steadily. The civil suit filed on behalf of the couple proceeded to court. Depositions, sworn statements, and irrefutable video evidence gave the case substantial weight. The court ruled in their favor, ordering the primary enforcer and the former HOA board to pay damages for trespassing, assault, emotional distress, and violation of homeowner rights. The decision sent a message far beyond the boundaries of the subdivision. HOA authority is not above the law. In parallel, the state's oversight agency completed its audit. Former board members were fined, barred from holding HOA positions in any state-recognized association, and referred for possible criminal investigation over financial mismanagement. One individual faced charges for falsifying records. Another was under review for misappropriation of funds. The state's final report urged legislative reform, citing this case as a prime example of how unchecked HOA power could lead to systemic abuse. The community had not only corrected its own wrongs, it had ignited a broader conversation about accountability in homeowner governance. Neighbors who once kept to themselves began to connect again. Community potlucks replaced board hearings filled with tension. Volunteer groups formed to help elderly residents with yard maintenance, not to enforce rules, but to build friendships. The atmosphere changed. Smiles replaced suspicion. People greeted each other not out of obligation, but from renewed trust. For the couple at the center of it all, the transformation was both relieving and affirming. The garden was restored, not just with flowers, but with new meaning. Every plant replanted was a reminder that dignity, once uprooted, could grow again. The porch, once a place of worry, returned to being a place of rest and reflection. Neighbors often stopped by to say thank you, not just for fighting back, but for standing when others couldn't. The man, though never seeking recognition, was quietly honored by the community. A small plaque was placed in the communal park, inscribed with the words, "For those who defend without expectation, honor, integrity, justice." It wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had the courage to speak up, who had risked retaliation to expose the truth, and who had chosen unity over fear. The experience changed more than policy. It changed people. It reminded them that communities are not defined by fences, paint colors, or mailboxes, but by the people who live there, by the way they treat one another, by the values they protect when no one is watching. In the end, it wasn't the documents, the videos, or the legal language that restored the neighborhood. It was the people, willing to come together, face discomfort, and hold the powerful accountable. The HOA enforcers had mistaken silence for weakness. But what they failed to understand was that silence, in the right hands, can become strategy. And when that silence ends, it echoes. Justice had been served. Not perfectly, not instantly, but thoroughly. The couple got their piece. The neighborhood got its voice. And a system built on fear was replaced with one founded on fairness. The scars would remain, but they would serve as reminders. Reminders that rights must be defended. That power must answer principle. And that when good people stand up, even the most entrenched injustice can be uprooted and replaced with something stronger, something real, something just, something worth protecting. And that's how one man turned quiet resistance into community justice. If you believe in standing up to abuse of power and protecting the people who can't always protect themselves, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories of courage, accountability, and justice. Until next time, stay aware, stay strong, and never let fear silence what's right.